Oh, guys, we gotta talk about student loans. With yesterday's announcement of Biden's student loan forgiveness plan, there's a lot to go over and some misconceptions we have to correct. So first, I want to cover some basic mechanics of loan forgiveness in general and how that works, and then we'll go over some potential economic effects. Once we've established that groundwork, we're then going to go over Biden's student loan forgiveness plan in specific. And then we'll briefly compare that to Bernie's proposal from earlier this year in April. If you'd like to see a follow-up video on what a more comprehensive plan might look like, and then a review of the evidence for and against free college tuition or government-subsidized college tuition, please do let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and without further ado, let's get to it. So to start with, we have to understand how loan forgiveness works. And to get to the bottom of that, we're going to draw pretty heavily from a paper that comes out of the Levy? I'm going to call it Levy. Economics Institute out of Bard College from 2018, February 2018, which I'll link to in the description. Anyone can see it. It's freely, publicly available. Feel free to take a look. It is 68 pages long. I've read all of it. Super interesting, very dense. We'll get the important parts here. So to begin with, I hear a lot of people calculating that we're going to have to print hundreds of billion dollars of extra money, and that this is going to cost a certain amount. And usually that's done with back of the envelope calculations of you take how many people are eligible for student loan forgiveness, multiply that by just the number, $10,000 per person. And I've seen estimates ranging anywhere from 200 to 400 billion. I think I've heard 800 billion before. And this is largely based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how exactly this works, especially the people that say that money printing is happening. That's not really what's happening. What is happening? You see, when borrowers take out loans, the Department of Education issues Treasury securities on their behalf that are then added to the Treasury's balance sheet. This has already been done. That happens when the loan originates. That's not something that, that's not a cost that's ongoing. That happens at the beginning, and then after that, the costs are primarily from the debt service on the security. In other words, basically the monthly interest payments. This is something that Bard College paper specifically points out, saying that the national debt would display an absolute increase in line with the debt service on the securities, not really in line with the actual principal amount of the securities themselves. Now, in practice, there's a lot of ways this can potentially be done, right? The government can just cancel all of the DOE's loans outright all at once. They already own the loans, so they don't have to purchase them, but they can just cancel them all at once. They can simply have borrowers stop paying and then just cancel them on a rolling basis as they come due. And then there's the issue of how exactly you deal with private loans, right? So private loans are different. They're not like what we just said. They are not issued based on Treasury securities that are already on the government's balance sheet, right? They are owned by essentially companies, right? The government would then have to acquire those private loans, and then they once again have the option of either canceling them outright all at once or having them canceled as they come due on a rolling basis. So what they found in the Bard College analysis was that basically for federal loans coming from the Department of Education, there's really not a big difference when it comes to forgiving over time and all at once. It ends up amounting to roughly the same thing. When it comes to the private loans, it's kind of similar. They use a kind of an accounting table, they call it T accounts. And ultimately, over the long term, whether you cancel it all at once or whether you cancel it over time ends up amounting to something relatively similar. At most, you could say that if you account with inflation, the real and nominal, there's a bit more of a disconnect between real and nominal values, and maybe you end up paying less over time if you drag it out. Now, some have proposed that you might be able to get around some of this if you simply transfer that debt to the Fed's balance sheet. Now, they specifically address this in the Bard College analysis, and basically what they find is that if you shift the debt over to the Fed, it really doesn't help you very much at all. Because sure, you're removing it basically one step further from the government, but the Fed would still have to purchase those securities from the Treasury, and then paying back those securities would be largely dependent on, from a reduction in the Fed's profit surplus. So then it would, instead of being paid back just based on the interest rate on the securities, it would also be dependent on how much profit surplus the Fed has on any given year. So sure, you could give it to the Fed, but the Treasury has to get paid by the Fed. And the Fed is going to only pay that off at a certain rate. They only have so much money in any given year. So that doesn't really help you very much. Okay, so I think we laid out most of the relevant mechanics here. There's actually a lot more detail in that section of the paper. You can check it out yourself. But right now I want to move on to projected outcomes, right? The stuff that the people are here to listen to, right? So remember, we're largely talking here about, one-time forgiveness of all student loans. If you want to see what happens with a smaller loan forgiveness program, you basically end up cutting all of these numbers drastically, which we're going to provide in a few minutes. And that means less good and less bad. You'll see what I mean. First, I want to just motivate this discussion. Why would we even consider student loan forgiveness? What's the point? First, we should realize that our current level of student loan debt burden leads to reduced business formation, increased susceptibility to economic shocks, things like, 2020, the pandemic. People end up needing a massive amount of support because they barely have enough to cover a $500, $1,000 unexpected expense, much less multiple months of, maybe not working or something like that. And then also, reduce consumption due to reduced disposable household income. Meza et al. 2016 showed that for every roughly 10% rise in student loan debt, that reduces home ownership rates by about 1 to 2% within the first 5 years of leaving school. As the workforce becomes more, as we say, credentialized, we've gotten to a point where you need more education to get to higher rungs in the job market, and each individual rung becomes less and less rewarding. OECD research from 2015 suggests that public spending on higher education far outweighs its costs, returning anywhere from 2 to 5x, $2 to $5 on every $1 invested, by way of lower unemployment, higher tax revenues, and more. Furthermore, with better average population education, you tend to see increases in average lifespan, average health span. You tend to see lower crime rates and more civic engagement, on average. There's also the benefit of increased socioeconomic mobility and intergenerational effects that tend to get passed down and snowball over time, leading to widespread societal knock-on effects, even for those who don't elect to get a college degree. Now, we will talk about the regressiveness and exclusion objection in the next section. But for now, just keep that in mind. Even if you don't get a degree, this is potentially beneficial for your demographic. Now, those are the social dynamics, but what about the monetary dynamics? Well, forgiveness of, once again, let's remember, all loans would lead to a boost in real GDP by $86 to $108 billion per year, leading to nearly $1 trillion in extra real GDP over the course of the 10 years of the Bard College analysis. It will reduce average unemployment by about 0.22 to 0.36%, and in the first few years, there's a projected increase of about 1.2 to 1.5 million jobs per year. Now, importantly, inflation would go up, but not really by a very macroeconomically significant amount, interestingly. You would think that there would be a lot, but at least for this projection, it's really not that much. Depending on which model they used, they got anywhere from 0.3 to 0.09% increase in inflation. Now, other metrics they did calculate were an increase in debt to GDP ratio by about 0.65 to 0.75 per year, and a rise in nominal interest rate targets by the Fed, anywhere from 0.2 to 0.5%. Now, just off bat, that sounds pretty good, right? I mean, sure, there's going to be prices that you have to pay anytime you do something this big. It's never unanimously positive. But given all the various knock-on effects, at least on paper, it seems like it would be worth it. But remember, this is if you forgive all loans. downsize all of these numbers pretty drastically if you want to see what would happen with a smaller loan forgiveness type program. Which brings us to... Now, we have a great resource in the form of the whitehouse.gov fact sheet on the new student loan forgiveness program. I'm going to link that below in the description. You should definitely take a look at that. Give it a moment. It's easy to read, easy to understand, and it gives you a lot of good context for everything that we're talking about right here and now. So Biden's plan has three main parts, but before we get into any of that, let me just quickly highlight this line right here. Okay? There's a reason that this is specifically being represented as a response to COVID, right? Some have made arguments that technically this move is essentially illegal, that Biden can't actually do these things without the consent and, approval of Congress. Well, that's kind of true, but technically what he's doing is he's essentially invoking emergency powers, and he's using COVID as the emergency. Now, not being a lawyer, I can't comment on how valid this is, but I thought it was interesting. Now, onto the actual plan. The most widely known aspect is the $10,000 loan forgiveness for any household or individual making less than $125,000, $250,000 if you're a married couple. That's for non-Pell Grant recipients. And then for Pell Grant recipients, they also have the $125,000 restriction, but generally not an issue with Pell Grant recipients. They can get $20,000 forgiven. Of more immediate importance to those left behind, like myself, is that the pause on federal student loan payments has been extended through the end of the year, so till technically December 31st, 2022. Secondly, it actually limits the monthly payments on undergraduate loans. They do specify undergraduate loans. It's now all income driven, and it's 5% of discretionary income. No longer 10%, 5% of discretionary income per month. For those with loans less than $12,000, they're done paying after 10 years, which basically extends a version of the PSLF to them. Which is huge, actually. The more I think about it, the more impactful that actually seems. It basically means that everybody is on income-driven repayment plans by default, which is a good idea, right? And it's half as much of your discretionary income per month. Now, as part of that, they also extend what they cover as, discretionary income, right? So nobody who is less than 225% of the federal poverty level will have to make monthly payments at all, essentially. It also covers monthly payments in the form that, if you're making monthly payments, even if it might be technically less than they might want from an interest rate perspective, you will not have any extra added to your principal. Lastly, this plan makes changes to the PSLF, or Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. PSLF is basically a program where if you work as a public servant for 10 years and you make consecutive payments throughout that 10-year period, at the end of that 10-year period, however much is left, there's no restriction on the dollar amount. A lot of doctors use this because we have a lot of usually a massive amount of student loans, and there's no limit on how much can be forgiven. So if you work as a public servant for 10 years, make payments throughout the time, at the end of that, they just forgive all the rest of your loans. This current plan really just changes it so that those who have worked at a nonprofit, in the military, or in federal, state, or tribal, or local governments get to receive credit for that as public service. It just makes it so that, a specific example Biden gave during the announcement, the press announcement, is like if you go to the military, they don't count it as public service, and you don't get to make consecutive payments. It doesn't count, so that then military members don't get PSLF because they did that, which he thought was unfair and doesn't really make a lot of sense. So he's just kind of fixing something that he thought was wrong with it. Now, here's the part that ruffles me the most, right? the way it talks about the future and how we're actually going to deal with this going forward. You can see that it simply says, protect future students and taxpayers by reducing the cost of college and holding schools accountable when they hike up prices. Okay, that is a nice, if extremely vague start, I guess. If we go a little further down on the page, we see that they specifically talk about doubling the Pell Grant and making community college free. Now, this, in my opinion, is the most important part of anything that they talked about on this fact sheet. And it's also the part that they definitely can't do by executive fiat. That has to be done by Congress. And it needs to be done. It is by far the more important part of this than anything. Any single one-time loan forgiveness plan is utterly inadequate because it does not address the underlying issues that got us here. The most important question you can ask when it comes to student loans, how the heck did we get here? Like, this is a very American problem. Our student loan debt, our level of burden is, among the developed countries, it's pretty unique. We, just like with healthcare, so goes education. We have not figured this out, and many other countries are just doing a better job than we are. And it just bothers me that this is effectively kind of an afterthought. On the one hand, I get it. You can only do so much with this emergency powers thing before, people start calling you a tyrant, even if it's for positive reasons, right? He kind of can't act too much on what he wants. He needs to push this and make sure Congress, gets a version of a bill with this through. But also, it's extremely frustrating. I get it. He's delivering on a campaign promise. He said that he would do the $10,000 of student loan forgiveness. But everybody needs to know that this is not a resting on our laurels moment. That is my biggest fear. That they're just going to say, well, we did this. I mean, look at this. We did it. We took care of it. You didn't take care of anything, actually. This is a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It's not going to be enough. This is nonsense. We got here for a reason. We'll get right back. Real quickly. There's people taking out loans right now as I speak. They haven't addressed the problem, is my problem. I mean, really, the structure of all of this is nonsense, right? Why are children being offered six-figure debts before they have any idea whether they'll ever be able to repay them? Before they decide what they're going to study in school? Should you be allowed to take on massive debt if you're going to study art history, gender studies? I'm not saying these things aren't valuable and worth studying, but you got to be realistic about how much money you can put on the line for these things, right? And if education is a public good, why do we stop treating it that way after the 12th grade? Everybody recognizes that children need to go to school. Well, guess what? We live in a world with, we're going to have electric vehicles. We're engineering things that are barely understandable when you see them, right? Like, you need to study a lot to be able to do any innovation in a world this advanced. Education is very much a public good. Higher education more than ever. And we treat it like it should be just nonsense, right? Like, if you need it, but you can't afford it, you just can't have it. I'm not saying everyone should get higher education. That's actually a problem I think is there. There's a lot of people that would really benefit from trade schools, community college. That's why I think that community college goal is great. 4-year college is not for everybody. And frankly, people need to start recognizing that. And, we touched on credentialization before. That's a huge issue, right? You shouldn't... My brother had to complete his 4-year degree to work at friggin', Target middle and upper management. Like, that's stupid, right? There should have been no reason for that. But he spent years of his life pursuing that just to work at, as a Target manager. They should have just let him do that. That's stupid. I don't think he got any more capable because he did that business degree, right? Now, drastically increasing the Pell Grant, as we'll see at the end of this section when we go over Bernie's plan, is actually a great idea. And like I said, making community college free, great idea, as long as he pulls it off. So I'll reserve judgment until we see exactly what happens. All right, on to other objections. So one particularly common objection is that this is unfair. An interesting way of characterizing this that I liked was that it's an alternate formulation of the trolley problem, right? So there's the trolley, and, well, I'll show you the picture right there. There's the trolley, and it's already run over a bunch of people. And so we're basically saying, if your argument is simply that it's unfair, well, we've already run over these people, so why should we save these people? I mean, like, it's unfair to the people that were already destroyed by the trolley if you save the next ones. That does kind of highlight the absurdity of that objection, at least on its face. But really, the real problem is bigger than that, right? Because it's not just a trolley with a small group behind and that same group in front, right? It's millions of groups in front of the trolley. So really, like I said earlier, the biggest objection is that you're not doing anything to save the millions. At most, you're just saving the one group in front of the trolley. Yes, it's hard to, make a reasonable objection to saving the people directly in front of the trolley. That's all well and good. That's fair. But it's not that less should be done. More should be done. So in a way, it is unfair. It's unfair to everyone that should be helped by a better system, right? You're just letting the trolley continue to do its thing. That's why it's unfair. Not because people are being helped, not because they're getting something that you didn't. It's unfortunate that you didn't get helped. Don't get me wrong. But every single effort that significantly improves society is unfair to somebody, right? It's unfair to somebody. When you legalize marijuana, right? There's millions of people in this nation that have been incarcerated for years, sometimes, especially in southern states, sometimes for their entire lives for relatively small possession offenses of just marijuana. And it's unfair to them, in a manner of speaking, to legalize it, as the states continue to legalize, because what the heck, right? They were in prison for years for simply having that. But does that mean that we shouldn't change the policy? Absolutely not. And that is not a apples to apples direct comparison, simply because we can and should do restitution to those people, and get them out of jail. We're ongoing still harming them, whereas people who paid off their loans, we're not still having ongoing harm to them. You know what I mean? So that's the difference in that particular analogy, but still kind of relevant. Then there's a somewhat more interesting objection that, this and really any single or one-time student loan forgiveness policy is inherently regressive because outstanding student loan debt technically mostly belongs to wealthier individuals. Or as the Bard College points out, the majority of it is disproportionately held by the top quintile. Now, while this point about distribution is technically true, it misses a lot, to the point where it's effectively leading you to the wrong conclusion. For this, we're actually going to refer back to that Bard College paper pretty heavily, as they have an entire section pretty much devoted to the issue of regression and distribution. They say that while it may be true that the median debt burden has not changed very much, while the amount of debt outstanding has increased, the median borrower has actually changed a great deal. So these days, more and more borrowers are what they would call non-traditional borrowers that are starting out or acquiring education later on in their lives, who may have less family support and may not be able to fall back on, that they have less of a family history of college attendance. They don't have as many higher earning alumni that they can potentially support them throughout that journey. And we should note as well that as state support for higher education is withdrawn, the individual burden for borrowers goes up. And a regressive result of this is that typically it's those institutions that are kind of financially worse off. They tend to take the steepest cuts to their budgets. as that happens. And so those institutions tend to be the ones that service those non-traditional students. And so they get hit the hardest. Put simply, this leads to a pattern where more debt is now being placed on people who are inherently in a worse position to be able to pay it off. So yes, the absolute value of student loans held by wealthier people is much greater than that held by poorer people, but the actual burden of those student loans has gone up dramatically amongst those poorer people. Specifically with regard to Biden's plan, this is why that 125,000 individual income restriction is in place. And as far as, that's why they also focus on forgiving Pell Grants, because 93% of Pell Grant recipients have an income less than $60,000 or a household income less than $60,000. A lot of other arguments are typically economic in nature and have to do with things like inflation and the deficit. But as we've already covered, even if you forgave all student loans in the entire United States, the effects of these things on a macroeconomic scale is not really all that significant. All right, before we go, let's take a quick look at Bernie's plan, the aptly named College for All plan, just like his Medicare for All. He's not very imaginative, but he has great solutions, which was proposed last April. It aims to provide basically three things. Tuition-free community college available to everyone, tuition-free and student loan-free attendance of 4-year public colleges for any students whose families make less than that $125,000 annual limit, which is likely where Biden got his, right? This all comes from Bernie. It's usually where this shit comes from. And tuition-free and attendance and student loan-free attendance to any public or private institution that is, a historically black college or otherwise serves minorities. It also provides for a doubling of the Pell Grant to $12,990, while tying further raises in the Pell Grant to inflation, and also expanding its use for non-tuition school expenses. As for how this will be funded, the College for All plan specifically is meant to use like a federal state partnership model, 75% federal, 25% state, which would be estimated to cost about $10 billion annually. And in this case, the federal part of that would be covered largely by a new tax on stock transactions that was specifically proposed by Standards. Now, one thing I didn't mention earlier when we were talking about Biden, the plan, if you listen to his press conference, the idea is that we've effectively already put in measures to be able to fund it. If you look at the decrease in the budget deficit that was basically planned out through the Inflation Reduction Act, hundreds of billions from that, they're basically trying to carry over that savings and justify this new spending based on that savings. Sidebar, the Inflation Reduction Act isn't going to reduce inflation. That's just a name. That's window dressing. It's nonsense. Interestingly, some experts actually estimate that factoring in things like scholarships and various supplemental grants that students can apply for, a doubling of the Pell Grant alone can actually effectively provide free tuition for many people at public colleges all by itself. As you can see, pretty much all of the major upcoming parts of Biden's plan are essentially just watered down versions of what Bernie wanted to do. The parts that actually seek to solve the underlying problems that led to this mess in the first place are all basically ripped directly from Bernie's platform, like almost without any changes, honestly. And this is often the case, right? For years now, Bernie has essentially set the pace for progressives in Congress. He says something like we should do this, and then everybody calls him crazy, and then eventually, 30 years later, they're like, oh, maybe we should do that. And then everybody forgets that it was Bernie that said that decades and decades ago. The man's been running on virtually an unchanged platform for like 40, 50 years. It's absolutely nuts. It's really a damn shame that he never actually became president at least once. Anyway, that's the video. If you made it this far, wow, that's pretty cool. Thanks for doing that. You were in the minority. Comment #MadeIt if you actually got this far, and pat yourself on the back. And anyway, as always, don't forget to drop a like if you got any value, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. That's it for today, and I'll catch you in the next one.